Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the second in our four series on the Iran nuclear agreement, in our four lecture series. I'm welcoming you here on my own behalf and on behalf of, that is to say, on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Middle East and for the Center for American and Global Security, which has partnered with us. And my thanks to the Center for the Study of the Middle East Associate, Chidam Balam, to Professor Shamit Ganguly, the Director of the Center for American Global Security, and to Ms. Bree Bailey, who is the Associate Director of the Center of CAGS, Center for American Global Studies. Our collaborations with them are often and always mutually beneficial for all concerned. I'm delighted to welcome a friend to Indiana University, Professor F. Gregory Gause. For years I've been pronouncing it Gause, and he hasn't corrected me until last night at dinner. It's Gause. Why it's Gause, I have no idea, but that's what he claims. And we'll give it to him since it's his name. So it's Greg Gause III, who is currently holds the John H. Lindsay 1944 chair. Welcome. In the Department of International Studies at the Bush School. I hasten to emphasize this, Bush 41. George Herbert Walker Bush School of Government, right? At Texas A&M. Prior to that, he was at the University of Vermont for about a decade, where he also chaired its Department of Political Science. He was also, and near and dear to my heart, director of Vermont's Middle East Studies program for also about a decade, and he has been a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Doha Center in Qatar. His PhD is in political sciences from Harvard, and he studied Arabic at the American University, Cairo, the AUC, and at Middlebury College. We're working to get the Egyptian dialect pronunciations corrected to Iraqi pronunciations. He's one of the country's leading experts, if not the country's leading expert, on the Arab states of the Gulf. We won't enter into the conversation as to whether it's the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf. It's the Gulf. And his most recent book is The International Relations of the Persian Gulf, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. He's a frequent contributor to the most prestigious journals on foreign policy and international relations, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Security Studies, the Middle East Journal, and the National Interest, as well as being a frequent witness before Congress. I could go on, but you have come to listen to Professor Gause, not to me. Please welcome Greg Gause.
Shukran Sa'adat al-Safir.
Fi khidmatikum.
I hope that was sufficiently Iraqi and not Egyptian for you. Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back at IU. Go Hoosiers. The Bush School of Government, which is my employer, is very happy for me to come out because we're always looking for students. We have what we think is the best value in the market in Masters in International Affairs degrees, and if you're interested, come and see me afterwards. I'd be very happy to talk to you about it. All right, the commercial's over, so let's talk about the regional effects of the Iran nuclear deal. I want to make 3 points today in a descending order of length, so don't worry when point 1 goes half the time. I want to make the first point I want to make is why I do not think that this deal will have much impact on the region-wide crisis currently enveloping the Middle East. I just don't think it will make much difference at all. The second point I want to discuss is why the Obama administration thinks I am wrong about that. I want to present their theory of the case for why they think the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, can change the politics of the region. And I'll tell you why I'm skeptical about their theory of the case. And finally, I'll conclude very, very briefly with a few comments on why, despite my pessimism that the nuclear deal can actually change regional dynamics, why, despite this pessimism, I still think, on balance, that it's a good deal for the United States. And were I asked, I would have supported it. So, why is this deal not going to be a game changer in the Middle East? This has to do with the current crisis that is enveloping the region right now. This crisis is not driven by conventional war. Right? This is not a crisis about countries massing armies, crossing international borders, and fighting over specific pieces of territory. Much of the international politics of past periods in the Middle East was dominated by such events. The Arab-Israeli Wars of 1956, 1967, 1973, even of 1982. The Iran-Iraq War, or Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, and the Gulf War that liberated Kuwait. In all of these, armies of states fought conventional wars over defined pieces of territory, and it was state-to-state battles that determined who was going to be driving the bus in the Middle East, right? That determined the dynamic of regional international politics. This current crisis is not like that. It's something else. This current crisis results from the collapse of state authority across so many parts of the Arab world. These political vacuums invite the intervention of regional powers, seeking to expand their influence and balance their regional rivals. Now, these regional powers, be it Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, even tiny states like Qatar that have played an outsized role in the crisis that exists in the region right now. These states do not send their own armies across borders to fight in these civil wars. Rather, they send money, they send guns, they send advisors, they send allied militias, they provide political support and propaganda support and the like. The current crisis in the Middle East is driven by the fact that you have so many political vacuums drawing in these regional powers for their own interests. And the winner, quote unquote, of this period of crisis is going to be the power whose local allies do the best in these regional civil wars. Nuclear weapons don't help you here. Nuclear weapons are basically unusable even in conventional war, but they are particularly unusable in these kinds of civil wars. The thing that drives, the thing that makes you win, the thing that gives you the advantage is your political ties, your ability to build networks of clients and allies in these fractured polities that then permits you to get them what they need to win their wars. Think about it. There is a nuclear power in the Middle East, right? Israel is a nuclear power. Israel has been basically unable to play any kind of serious role in the current unfolding crisis in the Middle East. Conventional military power and unconventional military power like weapons of mass destruction, I would argue, are irrelevant to how this regional crisis is going to work itself out. Now, the Arab world has always had patches of weak states, right? Areas where the state doesn't really govern its territory. And let me be clear by what I mean here by weak states, right? Normally when we talk about the term a weak state or a strong state in international relations, we're talking about its elements of power, the size of its army, the size of its economy, the like. That's not what I mean here. When I talk about a weak state in this context, I'm talking about the state, the government, the state's relationship to its society. Right? Does this state control its borders? Is this state able to enforce its law, provide services, right? Control its territory, police its borders? Some states are strong and able to do that, even though they might be weak internationally. But they have strong networks within their own societies, decent bureaucracies, the acceptance of some number of their citizens, the ability to enforce law, protect their borders, or at least police their borders, and provide services. The example I always use in class is Kuwait. Kuwait is a weak state in the international system. It cannot defend itself, as was proven in 1990. But from the point of view of its relationship to its own society, it's actually a strong state. There are no opposition militias operating in Kuwaiti territory. Kuwait polices its borders, enforces its law, provides services to its citizens, arrests people it doesn't like. Kuwait is actually a strong state when it comes to its own relationship with its society. So historically, there have always been weak states in the Arab world. Lebanon. Lebanon was a weak state by the choice of its elites. Right? Its own elites decided not to build a strong state because they felt that a strong Lebanese state would actually infringe upon these elites' prerogatives within their own sectarian communities. And thus Lebanon basically chose to remain kind of a night watchman state. And what was the result? Well, for some period of time, it made Lebanon the Paris, or it made Beirut the Paris of the Middle East, and Lebanon, right, the most interesting and wealthy and culturally diverse place in the Middle East. All good. But the Lebanese state was so weak that it could not prevent outsiders from playing into its domestic politics, as various of these groups, sectarian groups and militia groups and sectarian community leaders in Lebanon invited outsiders into the Lebanese system for their own purposes. And thus we saw Gamal Abdel Nasser play politics in Lebanon during the Pan-Arab period. We saw Syria play politics in Lebanon from the 1970s. We saw Israel try to play politics in Lebanon from the 70s through the 2000s. The Saudis, Saddam Hussein, and now Iran, all playing politics in Lebanon because the Lebanese state was not strong enough to fend off these foreign interventions. Now, note, and this is an important point, these outsiders didn't force themselves into Lebanon. They were invited into Lebanon by Lebanese parties who were seeking outside support for their own purposes within Lebanese politics. They needed the money, they needed the guns, they needed the political support against their own local rivals. And the Lebanese state was powerless to prevent this from happening, and remains so. But as long as it's a marginal, small state like Lebanon, you don't have a region-wide crisis. Governmental domestic weakness doesn't lead to region-wide crisis. The current crisis in the Middle East is the result of the growth in the number of these weak, fractured, in some cases failed states. We start with Lebanon, and to some extent Yemen, historically weak states in the region. But again, relatively marginal, relatively small. Then in 2003, the United States invades Iraq. Not a marginal state, not a small state. The state that was built by the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, fierce, authoritarian, hardly one that one would want to live under, but strong in terms of its own society, had been rotting from the inside. Sanctions from 1990. The inability of Saddam Hussein to break out of that international isolation in the 90s. His increasing reliance on his own sectarian community and even more narrow communities, his own hometown bunch of Tikritis, playing tribal politics. The Iraqi state was getting weaker and weaker. It had lost control of the Kurdish areas in 1990, 91. But what the United States did when it came in 2003 is basically kick the legs out of what remained of the Iraqi state. Right? It did so deliberately and as a matter of policy. Right? It deliberately destroyed the three bases of the modern third world authoritarian state. It outlawed the ruling party, the Ba'ath Party. It disbanded the Iraqi military. And it gutted the Iraqi bureaucracy by prohibiting people who had achieved a certain level in the Ba'ath Party from having high office in the Iraqi bureaucracy, even though in the Iraqi system you basically had to join the party and had to move up in order to gain a high-level position in the bureaucracy. So, as a matter of policy, the United States destroys the party, the army, and the bureaucracy, believing that we could build, from the bottom up, a new Iraqi state, a new Iraqi army, a new Iraqi political system. And we failed, right? We failed utterly. All of a sudden, Iraq, which had been a player in Middle East politics, becomes a playing field in Middle East politics. It becomes one of those political vacuums in which others are invited in by Iraqi players and parties because they need the support of those outsiders in order to gain, in their own internal disputes over power. And of course, the country that did the best in this new open Iraqi political system was Iran. Palestine, not a state, but a proto-state, also becomes a playing field for outsiders with the collapse of the Palestinian Authority writ in Gaza, the division between Hamas and Fatah, with Hamas controlling Gaza, Fatah controlling the West Bank. Another weak state in which outsiders can play. And then the Arab Spring. Yemen, always a weak state, becomes a failed state. Libya, a very strange and bizarre place, but one held together by oil money, the force of Gaddafi's personality, and his secret police, becomes a failed state. And most importantly, Syria. Syria, which had been the definition of a weak and unstable state in the early post-World War II years of Arab independence, where it had 3 military coups in 1949, a military coup in 1954, and a military coup in 1957, a military coup in 1961, a military coup in 1963, a military coup in 1966, and a military coup in 1970, but that last one headed by a guy named Hafez al-Assad, who then goes on to build a state. Not a nice state, not a friendly state, not a state that respects human rights, and not a democratic state. But Assad set about to build a state in Syria. He did it through the classical means of state building. He killed his opponents and built his army and collected money where he could find it. He was not a nice man, but guess what? Henry VIII was not a nice man either. And he was a state builder. And Cardinal Richelieu was not a nice man either. Right? Nice men usually don't build states. Right? The Syrian state built by this not very nice man has collapsed. Or if it's not collapsed, it has lost control over the society that Hafez al-Assad, through means that none of us would like to have practiced on us, had established his authority. And so, instead of having a few marginal places like a Lebanon, small, not unimportant, but small, a Lebanon, a Yemen, right? Instead of having a couple of places where state authority was weak or collapsed, and foreign powers, regional powers, played out their games of extending their influence and balancing each other, now we had multiple arenas in which this was happening. And not in marginal places, but in places in the center of the region. Strategically important states, oil states, states with relatively large populations. That is the crisis that the Middle East is experiencing right now. Now, Iran has been the state best positioned to take advantage of these regional changes for two reasons. First, its affinity with Shia groups throughout the Arab world. Now, sectarianism is the lens through which most outsiders tend to view the current crisis in the Middle East. It's Sunnis versus Shia. Right? And I don't want to downplay the importance of sectarianism, but I would argue that the sectarianization of politics in a place like Syria, a place like Iraq, a place like Yemen, a place like Lebanon or Bahrain, has to be understood first and foremost as a failure of the state. These sub-state identities, whether they're sectarian or ethnic, like the Kurdish identity in Iraq and Syria, these sub-state identities can come to the fore when state authority is weakened. And you can imagine why. Right? The basic fundamental thing a state is supposed to do is provide basic protection so you can walk the street, so your children can go to school without you fearing that they're going to be kidnapped or killed. When the state ceases to provide that basic level of order, you look for it somewhere else. You look for it in those communities where you think people will not kill you. You look for it in those communities where you think people have to take you in. You look for it in those communities where if you go, they will give you help, not reject you. And for various historical reasons, which we could talk about if we had hours and hours and hours, in Syria and Iraq, those communities have tended to be sectarian. Not completely, not always. At various points in their history, sectarianism was not nearly as salient as it is now, but those were periods when you had functioning states. Sectarianism, for me, is a really important part of the current crisis, but it's bottom-up. It's not top-down. It's not imposed by the Iranians and the Saudis on the region. It's bottom-up. As these states fail, in places where sectarianism has historically been an important element of political identity, people flock to the sectarian banner and then naturally look to fellow sectarians for Shia Iran, for Sunnis Turkey or Saudi Arabia for support. I think Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey are playing pure balance of power politics games here. They're utilizing sectarianism to advance their goals. To me, the driver of the sectarianism in the current crisis is bottom-up, and it's created by the failure of the state. But be that as it may, whether you buy that or not, right, it's absolutely clear that Iran has an affinity with Shia Arab groups who seek out Iran's support. Again, Iran does not force itself on its clients. Its clients are more than willing to invite Iran into their political system. If you're following Yemeni politics at all, and I'm sure each of you is, you would know that the Houthis, right, who we occasionally read about in the paper, are frankly much more anxious to be Iran's client than Iran is to be their patron. The second thing that Iran has going for it is its uncompromising position toward Israel, which gives it an entree into Palestinian Islamist politics. This is the Iranian entree into the Sunni world, right? This is where the Iranians can say, see, we are not sectarians, right? We are not sectarians. Look at our friends in the Sunni world in the Palestinian community who appreciate us because of our stance against Israel. And so Iran has been able to develop the most loyal, the most effective, and the largest network of clients and allies in the region. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, the dominant force in Lebanese politics. The strongest military force in Lebanese politics, the arbiter of government, a group that conducts its own foreign policy with little, if any, regard to what the nominal Lebanese government has to say. You know how long it's been since Lebanon hasn't had a president? Well over a year. And nobody cares and nobody notices. In Iraq, the Shia majority, empowered by the US invasion, has sought out Iranian help. Various groups, some of which have had long-standing ties to Iran, others of which have developed their ties to Iran in recent years, but all have looked to Tehran for support within their own fights against Arab Sunnis in Iraq, fights within the Shia community itself. And of course, Iran, since the early 1980s, has had a state-to-state alliance with Syria. This state-to-state alliance with Syria, I would argue, has nothing to do with sectarianism. Even though the ruling elite of Hafez al-Assad's Ba'athist Syria was largely drawn from the Alawi Shia community. To me, the Syrian-Iranian alliance is pure power politics. They had two common enemies, Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Israel. Hafez al-Assad's regime, believe me, was absolutely no model for the Islamic Republic of Iran. This was a secular nationalist regime. And if you lined up 100 Shia ayatollahs and mujtahids and Hujjatul Islams, 95 of them would tell you that the Alawis are not Shia because they're so heterodox. This was pure balance of power politics. Iran has achieved this position of, I would say, being, at least so far, the winner of this regional crisis. Not because of the strength of its conventional military. Nobody fears that the Iranian army is going to march across its borders and conquer its capital. That's not in the cards. Iran has not achieved the position of geopolitical power it has in the Middle East because of its nuclear prospects. Rather, it achieved this position because of its ability to forge strong ties with regional allies and clients. Ties of ideology, ties of practical support. Iran can provide its allies what they need to fight their civil wars. Guns, money, armed men, political support, training and advice. And its allies and its clients are loyal and committed. Saudi Arabia and Turkey have been unable to play in this game as effectively as Iran. The Turks have a great military, a NATO military, but are hesitant to use it. for all sorts of reasons that have to do with internal Turkish politics, the balance between the prime minister, now the president of Turkey, and the military that he shoved back into the barracks and shoved out of politics. The Turkish government, run by the AK Party, the Justice and Development Party, since the early 2000s, do have political allies in the Arab world, the Muslim Brotherhood. And Prime Minister, now President Erdogan, has cultivated Turkey's ties with Muslim Brotherhood groups throughout the Arab world. And these Brotherhood groups have looked to Turkey as a successful Islamist party coming to power in a secularist state and being able to maintain itself against a deep state of a military and a judiciary that at numerous turns tried to frustrate this Islamist party from consolidating its control. Unfortunately for the Turks, the Brotherhood in the Arab world is good at winning elections, but bad at fighting civil wars. The Brotherhood actually, I think, in most cases in the Arab world, made a strategic choice to go the electoral route. And we see what's happened to them as a result. Turfed out of power in Egypt by a military coup after they won the elections, and unable to carry the fight in Syria in the civil war. The Saudis do not have a great military. Though, as we see in Yemen, they're trying to develop a capacity for intervention across their borders that they did not have before. We'll see how that goes. The Saudis also have a big problem in this contest. Their natural allies, Salafi Sunnis, Wahhabi Sunnis, if you will, generally hate them. Saudi Arabia's natural allies from an ideological point of view are Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Yet these radical Salafi jihadist movements look at Riyadh as the enemy, not as the ally. They see Riyadh as having compromised and sold out their principles through an alliance with the United States, through numerous other things, numerous other positions. And both Al-Qaeda and ISIS have directly attacked the Saudi state. So for the Saudis, their natural allies regionally are a threat to them domestically. ISIS is as much of a threat to Saudi Arabia as it is to Bashar al-Assad or to the Iraqi government. I just repeat the point as I end this first part of the talk, that none of the advantages Iran has in the current regional crisis stem from its conventional military power. Nuclear weapons being even less usable in these circumstances would have even less impact on the current dynamics. Thus, to my mind, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will have little impact on the regional dynamics that we see. Conversely, had the agreement not been reached and Iran remained a threshold nuclear state and continued to develop its nuclear arsenal, I don't think that regional dynamics would have much changed either. I think the nuclear issue is largely irrelevant to the current regional crisis. So, why does the Obama administration think I am wrong? Well, they don't think I'm wrong. They don't care what I think. Right? But what's their theory of the case? Right? Why do they think that the deal does have the prospect of changing regional politics? Well, first off, this is not an ambitious administration in foreign policy, and no one in the administration would say we expect a nuclear deal to dramatically change regional politics in the short term. They are playing in one of the favorite terminologies of the members of this administration. They're playing a long game. So here's their theory of the long game. The more expansionist, interventionary elements of Iranian foreign policy like the Syria policy, like its policy in Iraq, are directed by players who are not members of the government per se, but who are part of the apparatus of the supreme leader. Most prominently, of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its expeditionary force, the Quds Force, headed up by the famous Qasem Soleimani, who has become kind of the face of Iranian policy in the Arab world, to the extent that there's this meme now all over the Arab world and in social media that kind of puts Qasem Soleimani in all sorts of places. You know, you can see Instagram pictures of all photoshopped, of course. Qasem Soleimani in Yemen, Qasem Soleimani here, it's almost like where's Waldo? You know, where's Qasem Soleimani today? So it's Qasem Soleimani and his friends, right, that are running this element of Iranian foreign policy that's interventionist in the civil wars around it. The political elements, the Obama administration's case here continues, the political elements that control the government now, the government of Iran, the presidency, the cabinet, the foreign ministry, are the Rouhani, Rafsanjani, quote-unquote, quote, moderate faction. And this faction has less interest in these regional adventures. They're more interested in good state-to-state relations, even with regional rivals like Saudi Arabia. Rafsanjani consistently says, publicly in the Iranian media, right, that we need good relations with Saudi Arabia. Right, consistently says that. Not so much since the most recent Hajj deaths. He'll lie low on Saudi for a while. But that's been his line for decades. This group, the quote-unquote moderates, right, have an interest in better state-to-state relations, not only regionally, but with the rest of the world. They have an economic interest in a more moderate Iranian foreign policy. These were the guys who were allowed to win the 2013 presidential election in Iran, right, in order to engage with the rest of the world to get the sanctions, to get the multilateral UN economic sanctions relief. And that's why we have a nuclear deal. The theory of the case goes on, I would argue, that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will strengthen this moderate faction. Now that they've done the deal, right, this moderate faction will be stronger because they will reap the benefits, the political benefits of the improved economic situation that the deal will bring to Iran. Over time, the long game, this moderate faction will be able to exercise more control over Iranian foreign policy, and Iran will begin to play a more constructive status quo regional role. This is the theory of the case. No one in the administration has set it out in as direct a way as I just did, but you can find it in the president's interviews on this, in Secretary Kerry's comments. It's not hard to tease out the logic that they have about why the Iran nuclear deal will lead to a more stable Middle East down the road. But this is a bet, right? They're taking a bet here, and I'm not sure it's going to come in. I have a hard time imagining any Iranian government that would want to give up the geopolitical gains of recent years, particularly in Iraq. Right? Remember, in the living memory of the leadership of Iraq, Iraq was the greatest threat to Iran. Saddam Hussein launched a war against Iran in 1980. Iraqi missiles rained down on Iranian cities in the mid-1980s. Iraqi forces used chemical weapons against Iranian forces in the mid and late 1980s. To go from that point to a point where Iran is now the dominant outside player in Iraqi politics is a huge geopolitical gain for the Iranian government. One also wonders if even the most moderate Iranian government would want to give up the geopolitical gains that the revolutionary regime achieved in Lebanon, where its loyal client, Hezbollah, is not only the dominant player in Lebanese politics, but can be deployed across borders by the Iranians for their purposes, as Hezbollah fighters fight in Syria to support Bashar al-Assad's regime. I don't think one has to be an Islamic revolutionary ideologue to see how Iran has benefited from these geopolitical changes. Even moderates might see their advantages. So I don't know if this bet is going to come in for the administration. So point number 3, why do I still think that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is basically a good thing for the United States? Well, first, I might be wrong. Maybe the bet does come in. Right? Maybe the Obama administration's theory of the case is right. And in fact, Iranian domestic politics moves toward the more moderate faction. Right? Maybe the drop in oil prices will lead to a rethink in Iran about the costs of an outward foreign policy. Maybe it will lead the Iranians at some point to want to, not tomorrow, but at some point to want to deal with the Saudis on oil price issues. Maybe it will lead these more expansionist and aggressive elements in the Iranian decision-making process to lose some of their power. I also don't see a real practical alternative right now to forcing Iran to change its behavior. Continued sanctions, I don't think would have the support of the other international players that made those sanctions bite. The great diplomatic success of the Obama administration here was being able to put together an international coalition on sanctions and get them through the United Nations. Right? To have these be multilateral international sanctions, not the bilateral sanctions that the United States has put on Iran since the revolution of 1979. But in order to get that international coalition behind sanctions, the Obama administration had to have a modest and achievable goal. And that modest and achievable goal was a nuclear deal that would bring Iran's nuclear infrastructure under greater international supervision and limit and roll back some of the advances in that infrastructure. Right? If the Obama administration had put regional issues like Syria and Lebanon and Iraq on the table at that negotiation, not only would the Iranians not have done the deal, but I think it would have lost the international support it had on sanctions. So I'm willing to more than concede the point that I might be wrong and that the Obama administration's theory of the case might be right. And I don't have a better alternative for how to affect Iranian foreign policy actions. Sanctions, I don't think we can maintain multilateral sanctions. And direct military action, I don't think is a practical course of action for the United States on this. The possibility of a more normal U.S.-Iran relationship at least holds out the prospect that we can talk to the Iranians more directly, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I said that I thought that the root cause of the crisis in the Middle East right now is the collapse of state authority. one of the conclusions I draw from that is deal with states. They have addresses, right? They have interests. You can deal with them in a regular diplomatic way. And even if you disagree with some of the things they do, they're a heck of a lot easier to deal with than ISIS. And Iran is one of those states that controls its territory, polices its borders, sometimes suppresses its citizens, but also provides them with services. It's not a government that's going away. Another reason why I think that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is basically a good idea is that it does lessen the prospects for Iranian nuclear breakout. That's a good thing. I don't want to exaggerate its benefits. I don't think it's going to make much difference in the regional crisis, as I've argued. But the fewer nuclear powers in the Middle East, the better. It reduces the chances of a direct Israeli attack on Iran, with the negative consequences that would have for the US, because we would be blamed for it by the Iranians and retaliation would occur against our interests. It reduces the political pressure for the United States to strike Iran directly, political pressure that one only has to listen to a Republican presidential debate to understand. And it reduces the proliferation incentives for other regional powers like Saudi Arabia. Now, I don't want to exaggerate any of these things. Right? If we had more time, I would make an argument that I really don't think Iran was ever going to weaponize. I think it kind of liked this ambiguous situation of maybe they have it, maybe they don't. We better not mess with them because they might get it. I always thought that the chances of a direct Israeli strike on Iran were very, very low for both logistical reasons and strategic reasons, which we can get into in questions if you're interested. And I never thought that Saudi Arabia was a likely proliferator. Right? The Saudis have plans for all sorts of nuclear plants in the country. Not a single one has there been ground broken on yet. And that's not because the Saudis don't have the money to do it. Other people say that the Saudis, well, they could just rely on the Pakistanis to give them the bomb. Well, when the Saudis asked the Pakistanis to send troops to Yemen, the Pakistanis said no. It's possible the Pakistanis could say no to them on nuclear issues as well. So I don't want to exaggerate the benefits of the Iran nuclear deal. But if it does back Iran away from nuclear breakout and slightly reduce the chances of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, that's not a bad thing. So the bottom line for me is 2 cheers for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Not 3, just 2. Just don't expect it to change the dynamics of the dangerous and maddening regional crisis in the Middle East anytime soon. Thank you. Questions? Professor Gangoul.
Greg, 20 years ago, or approximately then, I heard you give a talk as sweeping as this about sort of developments in the Middle East. And one of the central themes that ran through your talk was that despite wars, invasions, attempted invasions, coups, one proposition remained, that the borders were unchanged, that they were fairly stable. We no longer face that. What kind of an era are we entering now?
I disagree, actually. I think that my 20-year-old self is still right. Why do I say that? The borders of this part of the world, in the Levant, were drawn by outsiders, and they will only be changed by outsiders. Right? ISIS can destroy all the border posts between Iraq and Syria. That doesn't mean that one single government will recognize that border change. Lebanon, right, ceased to have an effective central government, if it ever did, in the 1970s. The borders of Lebanon never changed. Real political power in Lebanon was decentralized, but the borders didn't change. I think that what we're going to see, frankly, is the Lebanonization of the whole Fertile Crescent, where the borders will remain the same. Internationally, people will say, well, there's a Syria that's governed from Damascus, and there's an ambassador there, and there's an Iraq governed from Baghdad, and there's an ambassador, we send an ambassador there, even though real and effective authority will be in the hands of local players, some of whom will not respect these boundaries. I think that the clearest evidence that my 20-year-old self is still right is the Kurds in Iraq. They are de facto independent. They have their own army. They have their own government. They run their own foreign policy. They have to care a little bit about what happens in Baghdad, but they're not obsessed with it. And yet they don't declare independence. They don't run up the flag. They don't ask for the UN seat. They don't do any of those things. Why? Because they don't think the international players would support them. And if they thought the United States would support them, I think they'd declare independence tomorrow. Right? But because the outsiders are not interested in redrawing these borders, the local players who might want to are not going to be able to do it. That doesn't mean that the thing that has changed, and about which I was wrong, right, is that I thought, see, I can admit error occasionally. The thing that I was wrong about is that I thought that the strengthening of the Arab state, right, these brutal guys like Hafez al-Assad and Saddam Hussein, and to a lesser extent, but not nice, Faisal in Saudi Arabia, right, and Nasser in Egypt, they were building states. The Shah in Iran, right, they were building states. It wasn't pretty, but that these states would, over time, right, become more and more and more kind of fixed in their authority in their societies. That's where I was wrong. That's where I was wrong. Right? The state in Syria and the state in Iraq, for various reasons, have not done that. So to me, kind of the interesting analytical question is why, in some parts of the Arab world, the state building project has failed, and in other parts of the Arab world, if it hasn't succeeded, at least it hasn't failed yet. Right? So these are all the questions that come out of Arab Spring. Right? Why monarchies? Why no monarch was overthrown in the Arab Spring? That's an interesting question. Topic for another talk, not this one. Right? Why only one oil state had its government overthrown? And that was by outside intervention in Libya, not by domestic. If you'd left Libya alone, Gaddafi would still be in charge. For good or for ill, he'd still be in charge. So to me, that's the interesting analytical question, and that's where I was wrong. Saadet to Sophia, and then
Shukran Saadet to Ustad. I want to follow up actually right on that. I want to push back on the notion that Gaddafi and Assad and Saddam were state builders. They built institutions which sort of held things together while they were able to hold things together, which I recognize somewhat circular. They did not, in fact, build state institutions. And I'm not able to articulate, a pithy sort of end to that story. But they weren't interested in building state institutions. I would argue they dismantled existing state institutions. They made the state dependent on their person in ways that even Henry VIII didn't. He did in other ways, having to do with the Church of England and all that, but we'll leave all that aside. So I want to push back on that and
challenge you, if I may, to defend that premise a bit better. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way.
Yeah, no.
To defend that premise,
It's a
which you
legitimate
stated,
challenge.
which, to be fair to you, you stated but did not elaborate on. So I would ask that you defend the premise. I'm sorry, I didn't
Sure.
mean that the way it sounded. The second thing I'd like to challenge you on is, or push back on, I don't want to say challenge, but push back on, is the notion that the sectarianism has been bottom up. And I know why you say that, but there's also a top-down element to it. And I think the clearest example I can give you is from Iraq, post-2003, when Abdulaziz al-Hakim, the head of the Shia religious party, the
Supreme Council of the
Supreme
Islamic
Council.
Revolution.
At the time, the Islamic Revolution in Iraq
Right.
was its name.
Right.
In the period when the Constitution was being drafted, he called upon sort of the Shia of Iraq to unite in the face of certain demands which were being made by the Kurds with respect to consociationalism. Had he instead appealed to sort of the Arab, Iraqi nationalism, or at least to Arab Iraqi-ism, he might have led in a different direction. My point is, I think you could, I think you can make a compelling case that in places like Iraq, and to a lesser extent in Syria, which I agree was more of is a different kettle of fish, but in post-2003 Iraq, there's been a tremendous top-down sort of leaderships did what leaderships do. It led its populations in a particular direction. Regretfully, it was in the direction of sectarianism. I'd be interested in your thoughts on those 2 points.
On the premise of state building, each case here is different, but I will say that I think that, with the possible exception of Gaddafi, who was trying to run a theoretical experiment of a state without government, basically, I think that you can make the case that in all of the Arab states, even these personalist leaders were building institutions of social control that over time could have devolved from personalist control to more institutional control. So armies, right? Armies, secret police forces. This is not pretty. This is not pretty, but these are the institutions that were being built, and state control over the economy, right? And state control over the economy was also perhaps not the best choice to make. It's inefficient and all, but it extends the state's control over society. And in all of these places, what did we see in the 70s, 80s, and with the exception of Iraq under sanctions in the 90s, we saw increase in the size of the army and the police forces and the security forces vis-a-vis the weaker periods of the 50s and 60s in these states. We saw increasing state control over the economy in the oil states because, of course, the oil comes into the central government. Inevitably, right, the state will play a larger role in the economy. But also in the non-oil states. And we saw greater state control of media, greater state, the marginal freedoms and more than marginal freedoms that many Arab countries' citizens enjoyed in the 50s and even into the 60s, right, were rolled up in this period. Now, this is not a pretty picture, but I think it's a picture of state building. Your argument is that these institutions were so dependent on an individual that once that individual kind of goes, the place falls apart. I think in the case of Iraq, it's harder to make that case because of it was the imposition of, it was Saddam's own stupid foreign policy decisions that lead to the imposition of the most brutal regime of sanctions in the modern world that basically hollows out that state building process. In Syria, I think it was there, and that these institutions crumbled under the intense pressure of civil war. We'll see if they can be rebuilt, but I don't know. I do think that we have some data, at least on the size of bureaucracies, the size of militaries, the percentage of the national economy under control of the state, in that 3-decade period of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that gives some indication that state control over society was increasing through the building of institutions, I would argue. But we'll have to argue this out over data, I think, which hopefully I can provide. I've done some writing on this. Sectarianism as bottom-up, not top-down. I think Iraq in 2003 was a particularly plastic moment. I think, if certain leaders had made other choices, Iraqi politics could have gone in a different direction. That would have been difficult, right? Because the atmosphere had been sectarianized by Saddam in the way he reacted to the uprisings of 1991, his faith campaign, which was basically a Sunni campaign to try to maintain power in the 90s. But you're absolutely right. If you didn't have a sectarianized opposition with Iranian support coming into Iraq and saying, hey, we're representing the Shia community, perhaps you could have had a different reaction. If Muqtada Sadr, who nobody expected to be the player that he became in Iraqi politics, nobody knew that the Sadr network was as strong as it was, having gone underground. If he was more of a statesman and less of who he is, perhaps he could have taken that role. But he didn't. If the Americans had taken a different stance on sectarianization, and one can argue a lot of ifs in 2003, and I grant you that was a particularly volatile moment at which Iraqi politics could have gone in different directions. But it did go in the sectarian direction. And I would argue at least partially that was because of pressures from below. Pressures from above as well, but pressures from below. These sectarian messages seem to attract greater support. The people who were making the other cases in Iraq didn't seem to be able to get that kind of support. Sir?
Thank you. I also have two questions. The first one is a follow-up on your response to Professor Gangoli's question. You mentioned that the borders are not going to change as long as the external powers do not want it to be changed. And my question is, why don't they? Because we know that there was a debate going on, if not recently, just a couple of years ago, in terms of dividing Iraq up into 3 areas and so on and so forth. So that is a real debate, and there's some potential for that to pan out.
Right.
My second question is about, I understand your skepticism about the long game not being played out the way the administration would like it to play out, but I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on that first premise of the long game, that is for the Iranian regime to move towards moderation because of this deal. I would like to get your perspective on how likely or unlikely that is.
Right. Okay. So the border's not changing. All of the outside powers, frankly, have an interest in the status quo in the Middle East. And none of them, as far as I can tell, have an interest in a dramatic change in the Middle East. Because a dramatic change in the Middle East right now benefits Salafi jihadists, right? Who is the major cross-border player that holds territory in the Middle East who, if you were redrawing the borders of the Middle East today, could claim, we have a state here, draw a border around it and recognize it. It's ISIS, and nobody has, the Russians don't, the Americans don't, none of the regional governments do, right? So I think partially it's just that short-term interest, right? I think the Kurds are an even better example here because, the Kurds would be America's best ally. They'd be our closest ally. They would do whatever we asked them to do. They would be the, they would be the Kuwaitis of the northern part of the Middle East. But nobody in the United States wants a new client, particularly a client that we can't reach from the sea, because we're basically a sea power. You know, the maintenance of another Middle Eastern client is not seen as a positive by the American political class, it's seen as a negative. And thus they constantly tell the Kurds, no, stay in Iraq, no, don't do it. I can imagine that there might be some change in configuration where a great power would say, yeah, let's rip it up. But a lot of things would have to change on the ground for that to happen, it seems to me. And one of which is that Salafi jihadism would have to recede as a powerful element in the equation. So that's why I think, you know, and yes, there was talk about a division of Iraq by some, you know, relatively responsible people, including someone who lucked into the vice presidency of the United States. But as far as I can tell, it never got beyond talk. I mean, it was never seriously considered as an option within the American government. All sorts of people outside said, oh, we should just do this. But nobody in the American government, as far as I can tell, Ambassador Strabati might be able to correct me on the record here, but I don't think it was ever really a serious proposition within the government itself.
I think you're quite right about that, in fact. Can I just drop
Yeah,
a
yeah,
footnote
yeah.
on that? You also have to take into account that the Kurds themselves aren't united. Nobody's united. There's no shared vision amongst the Shia for a Shia state. There's no shared vision amongst the Sunni for a Sunni state in Iraq. There's no shared vision by the Kurds for a Kurdish state in Iraq.
Although they're the closest of it.
They're the closest, but they're not close enough. They don't have an army, they have two
They
armies.
have two armies.
They don't have a government, they have two
Two
governments.
governments.
And they may be developing a third.
Right.
So, theoretically you could say that, but when you actually look at the players on the ground, you don't have raw material to make it happen. You would atomize Iraq if you start playing around with the borders, in my opinion. And I'm sorry, I'm treading on your turf now.
You made the case much better than I could. The Iranian regime moving toward moderation. Look, I'm on shaky ground here. I study the Arab world, and particularly the Arab states of the states of the Arabian Peninsula, and U.S. policy toward the region. I don't speak Persian. I'm a consumer of scholarship on Iran. I'm not a producer. So I'm going to reflect this as just kind of a consumer who follows Iran, but who makes no special claim to expertise. You know, the search for the Iranian moderate has been, you know, something that America has engaged in since 1979. You know, we occasionally find them, but I don't think we have a great understanding of the dynamics of Iranian internal politics. That being said, undoubtedly there are factions in Iran. I mean, we see them, they play out their games of power, they play out their contests, sometimes in the electoral arena. So it's easy to watch because they have to make their case to their voters. But it seems to me that the people who we in the West would call moderate, while they can win elections, they don't have their hands on the ultimate levers of power in Iran, which are still held by the supreme leader and by institutions that report directly to him, whether it be the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or the Bunyads that control a substantial percentage of the Iranian economy. And thus the government can do what it feels like, but it can't fundamentally change the direction of the state. Now all of this seems to be a negotiation, right? The supreme leader negotiates with the government negotiates with the supreme leader. Elements within the government negotiate with each other and negotiate with the IGRC, the IRGC. And the system has a strange kind of stability, equilibrium to it, right? In 2009, millions of people came into the streets to protest the system, the Green Movement. And it didn't change, right? It didn't change. In the end, many of the people that we would identify as moderates who might have sympathized with the Green Movement weren't willing to take that next step and say, let's turn this into a revolutionary movement that will actually change this system. They backed away, right? Khatami, at every point in his presidency, the 8 years of his presidency, when he was confronted with the opportunity to basically take the fight to these entrenched, unelected elements of the Iranian government, he backed away. I don't know if Rouhani doesn't seem to me to be the kind of guy who would do that. So if this is going to happen, it seems to me it's going to happen over a long stretch, over a number of changes in the person of the supreme leader, who over time will, for whatever reason, either give up power or have less power or become more a figurehead. But I don't see this. I don't see the current supreme leader giving up the kind of power that he exercises, and I don't know why his successor would do so. But I've been over here. Do we have any questions on this side? No. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Professor Gause, you mentioned Vice President Biden.
Yes.
In a
Not by name, but you accurately.
In a famous moment of indiscretion at Harvard, Biden answered a student question about Saudi support for extremist groups. A couple of weeks ago, Thomas Friedman had a very outspoken column saying that if you were really to look at support for terrorism, Saudi Arabia puts Iran to shame. Do you think that this, number one, is accurate, and number two, does it stem from any sense of insecurity within Saudi Arabia about the legitimacy? And I might, in this context, mention an extremely strange article, which I imagine you read at the time, in 2002, that caught my attention, called "The PowerPoint That Rocked the Pentagon" by Laurent Moravian, that was arguing that one of the purposes of the invasion was to destabilize Saudi Arabia by encouraging the Shiites in eastern Saudi Arabia, without getting into quite the Baroque ornamentation of Moravian's argument. Is there a wider crisis of legitimacy? You've been discussing crises of legitimacy in failed states. Is the new government that seems to be more aggressive under King Salman reacting to a perceived deficit of its own legitimacy? And where, if that kind of George Kennan-like sources of, driver, sources of Saudi conduct, if that's going on, where is it going to drive Saudi policy?
Right. So to fully respond, we would have to begin another hour-and-a-half session. But let me shorthand this for you. First off, the Moravian argument back in 2002, 2003, after the 9/11 attacks, was just an extremist neocon fantasy. That was repudiated even by responsible neocons. There was in the wake of 9/11 some talk, much as there was talk about breaking up Iraq.
Indeed.
There was talk about breaking up Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Because 9/11 happened and we have to punish these people. I got a call from the Hudson Institute, which is one of these neocon outfits, saying, "You want to join a study group? We're going to talk about the breakup of Saudi Arabia." And I said, "Wait a minute. You mean a Shia state?" "Oh, yeah, of course. They're Shia. They're good moderates. They'll sell us the oil." I said, "They're going to look to Iran as an ally. Oh, no, they won't. These are the same people who thought, of course, that, you know, American troops in Iraq would be
Yes.
greeted with rose water.
Sweets
And
and
rice.
flowers.
Yeah.
Sweets and flowers
Sweets and
was the
flowers.
phrase.
So yeah, I'll set that one aside. I think the more serious questions here are support for terrorism and what's the Saudi government doing these days. I don't think that the Saudis are supporters of terrorism to the same degree that Iran is, by our definition. By our definition of terrorism, we identify Hezbollah, we identify Hamas, we identify various Iraqi militias as terrorist groups. And the Iranian government directly supports these, and is unapologetic about it, and it doesn't like them, right? There's plenty of support for Al-Qaeda and ISIS in private sources of funding in Saudi Arabia. I've never seen any convincing evidence that the Saudi government supports these groups. Now, one can argue that the Saudi government propounds an interpretation of Islam that is the ideological wellspring of these groups. And I won't argue that, I think that's true. But the Saudis lost control of that in the 1990s, right? We would have to go back in time about 50 years to be able to kind of lean on the Saudi government to clean up Salafism, right? That horse has now left the barn. And these Salafi groups, right, have basically rejected what Saudi Salafism was, which was xenophobic, illiberal, incredibly conservative, literalist, all patriarchal, all those horrible things, right? But profoundly loyal to the Saudi state. And the official religious establishment in Saudi Arabia remains that. I would argue that many of the people who are defined as opposition in Saudi Arabia, when faced with a crisis in 2001, right, when it looked like the world was going to turn on this regime, rallied to support this regime because they couldn't imagine a Wahhabi Arabia without Saudi leadership. The difference of bin Laden is that he could. He could imagine that, right? And that's why Al-Qaeda was not able to secure widespread public support in Saudi Arabia. It tried, and it conducted an attack on the Saudi state from within Saudi Arabia from 2004 to 2007, got rolled up, was unable to mobilize support, was unable to, be the fish swimming in the Revolutionary Sea, and was kicked out of Saudi Arabia and now is in Yemen. I think ISIS is going to find the same problem in that the Salafi movement outside of Arabia, the Saudis have lost control of. They lost control of it in Iraq, they lost control of it in Afghanistan, they lost control of it in Egypt where they ran for elections and got 25% of the vote in the Egyptian parliamentary election. Believe me, the Saudi regime doesn't like the idea that Salafis think that elections are a good thing, right? The Saudis have lost control of global Salafism, and that's a fascinating story. And there's been some academic work done on it, but not enough. In fact, I think that this is probably the under-researched story of the last 20 years of Middle Eastern politics, is both the growth of Salafism and its kind of the streams coming off of it from a political point of view. Okay, so I think that ideologically, it's true, the Saudis are the wellspring of this, but there's not much they can do about it now. And I don't think that they're actually funding these guys. That being said, we and the Saudis have a profound difference in our priorities in the Middle East right now. American priority in the Middle East right now is clear. Who are we bombing? We're bombing ISIS, right? We see ISIS, the Obama administration sees ISIS as the major, if not the only, but certainly the major threat emanating from the Middle East. The Saudis see ISIS as a threat, but they see Iran as the bigger threat. And for them, Syria is the one chance they have to roll back Iranian power in the Arab world. And we and the Saudis are not on the same page on that.
If I may just briefly follow up on one point of your response, and that was about the definition of terrorism.
Yeah.
Isn't this in part a result of the major factor we haven't talked about here, and that is Israel? That because of Israel's point of view, terrorism is defined even by the US government, but certainly by our Republican candidates, for example, in terms that threaten Israel. Whereas the Obama administration is increasingly differentiating between threats to Israel and a sort of a global metastasizing force that they feel like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, that they feel could threaten Europe and the United States.
But I think that that's less a definitional fight than a priorities fight, right? In that no one in the Obama administration is calling for taking Hamas off the
Right,
terrorist
indeed,
list, right?
indeed.
Or taking Hezbollah off the
Quite,
terrorist
quite.
list, right? That's a bridge too far.
Yeah, sure.
But I do think that, that this administration is concentrated very much on the ISIS threat. My guess is frankly that a Republican administration would do the same if it succeeded. Because ISIS is the growing threat. I mean, Hezbollah is kind of there. Hamas is kind of there. They're no immediate threat to any American interests.
Right.
But Americans believe, and we can argue whether this is a correct conclusion, but I would say the vast majority of Americans, both at the popular level and at the elite level, see ISIS as the successor to Al-Qaeda and thus a direct threat to American interests. And I think that would be where we would see the concentration. Anybody else? Yes?
I just wanted to look at the Iranian agreement from an internal point. And as you know, there are two big political parties in Iran. The parties which is led by Khatami and after that Rouhani. And the other party, they are radical party and they are more religious.
Right.
And as we know, just now, the radical party doesn't want the agreement to be happening.
Right.
Just now, there are some demonstrations, some objection in Iranian parliament that they say that we want to have any deal with USA. As we know, this party is just has more benefits. Is benefit more from the sanction. For example, as you said, Qasem Soleimani's group, I mean that's Sepah, has some benefits from sanctions because they just constitute some companies, private companies, and governing it by Sepah and have some business benefits from that. So if you say that just this deal would be against the peace in Middle East, why the party that they want to have more power through Syria and Iraq doesn't want this agreement?
So
That's a
let's.
question, by the way. I think we need to.
Okay, very good. So let me clarify if I could, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear on this. I don't think that the agreement is bad for peace in the Middle East. I just think it's irrelevant for peace in the Middle East. And so I don't think that folks on the hardline side in Iran have an interest in supporting the agreement because it will lead to a less stable, more conflictual Middle East. Rather, I just don't think that the agreement is going to have much impact either way toward a more stable or a less stable Middle East. So I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. I wouldn't characterize Iranian politics as two parties. I would characterize it as two factions that are they're not organized the way a party is, right? They don't have an internal discipline. They don't have a party structure where the party determines its leaders and adopts a platform, right? They're basically two orientations. One, more committed to a revolutionary message, more committed to the implementation of what they think of as Islam in public life, in terms of the role of women and things like that in society, and more willing to play a revolutionary role in regional politics. politics. And another faction that, while not rejecting the Islamic Republic as the framework of government, and certainly not rejecting, right, Islam as the defining element of public life, are less hardline about its implementation, and who would like to conduct a more normal state-to-state foreign policy with the world, right? Not be under sanctions, all those kinds of things. But these are factions; they're not parties, so they're not disciplined, and they split, they reformulate, particularly on this quote-unquote moderate side, right? They don't seem to be able to actually consistently present a unified front. Sometimes the people who are even more opposed to the regime won't back these moderates, sometimes they will. And so it seems to me that it's this fluidity in Iranian politics that makes it harder to get the kind of social movement that would be able to make a sustained challenge to the fundamentals of the regime. 2009 was a point at which that might have happened, but it didn't, right? And so I think when regimes kind of survive big crises like that, they buy themselves some time, right? It's the same thing in Saudi Arabia. And we question about Saudi legitimacy. Saudi Arabia was the major Arab state least affected by the Arab Spring. No serious public mobilizations, except in the Shia communities, and those had as much to do with what was going on in Bahrain as it did with what was going on in Saudi. And so I think both the Iranian regime and the Saudi regime, although they have serious problems, actually are in pretty good shape. And the biggest problem that both of them face is that oil prices have gone down so far, because they both, to some extent, have built patronage states. Can they sustain those patronage states? The Iranians, not as reliant on oil, but still facing serious economic problems. That's why I think they agreed to this deal. The Saudis, $650 billion in the bank, but that's down from $750 billion a year and a half ago. They're burning through cash. They can't sustain that. Can they find some way to sustain their patronage state without burning through cash the way they're doing it? That's the big challenge, I think, the Saudis have.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And please rejoin us as we convene again on the 5th of November for Alan Cooperman, who will tell you why the Obama administration's all wrong about this deal.